I'm Niels Botha. I'm in New Zealand. I've been involved in the heifer rearing project for a little bit. And I've met Sarah. So Sarah, it's my pleasure to introduce you to the rest of the group. Sarah is in Te Awamutu, not too far away from Hamilton. She's with DairyNZ and she plays a key part in heifer rearing. So Sarah, we're looking forward to hearing what updates you have for us today. And yeah, all the best. And over to you.
Excellent. Thanks, Niels, for the introduction. I'm just going to give a quick overview of what I'll cover in the next 20 minutes. But while I'm doing that, if you could just raise your hand if you've heard me present before or Rob present before on the heifer grazing project, just so that I can paste it and hit the audience on what you have or haven't heard from us before. So, John, when you've got the tally, can you just let us know
sure.
how many people have heard me present before?
Good. And that's a great question to start with, Sarah. And at this stage, excuse me, I can only see one hand. So you've got a fresh audience all waiting to hear about your project.
Oh, excellent. Okay. So from speaking to Akiko, the plan is to touch on why the project received its funding, the approach we took, and then the outcomes so far. And then at that point, I'll stop for questions, and then I'll finish with personal learning I've had about the process. So why the project received funding. There was a review of the NCAS program, which is the New Zealand dairy industry program for improving herd reproduction, that was released in 2007 or 2008. And the feedback from people who were involved or people who used it was that there was a lack of stakeholder involvement, as well as there was lack of flexibility on the delivery. And as part of herd reproduction, heifer rearing is one of the 8 things that contribute to improved reproduction on farms. So at the time that the project started about 3 years ago, the data that we had available to us was from LIC's Mind of Weight program, looking at how heifers were grown relative to a genetic prediction of what their live weight would be, which is the objective measure that we have for heifer performance. And the result was that 11% of heifers were behind, or on average, heifers were 11% behind target at 22 months, and 73% of the heifers in that data set were more than 5% behind target. So we know that these things have a negative impact on herd reproduction. And when we look from a financial point of view from the industry, when we started the project, we thought it's worth about $120 million if we can improve and get heifers up to target. It's potential that it's more than that, but the industry hasn't necessarily agreed on what that larger number is. Of course, to make improvements, that has a cost. So there is a cost to achieve that. And so based on the feedback that we've had from the NCAS program about stakeholder engagement and involvement, we wanted to take an approach that took the stakeholders as part of how were we going to try to tackle this issue around heifer rearing and improving what we were doing. So as a lead-in, that was kind of the lead-in that we had to start cooking up what we were going to do for the project. And I distinctly remember at the beginning asking for the recipe of how we were going to apply the co-innovation approach to heifer grazing. And when I cook, I always use recipe books. Even if it's just to adapt or adjust a recipe, I always start with something in concrete. And this is particularly true when I'm cooking something that I haven't worked with before. So recipes are quite nice because I think they can give you guidance on what you're doing, because if you're baking a cake versus making a casserole in a crock pot, there's quite a different approach that quite different ingredients that you need to have, as well as resources. So the other thing I like about recipes is it can give you guidance on the best product for the recipe. So for example, if a recipe calls for self-rising flour, once you get to know what self-rising flour does, you can start to adapt that. Oh, well, actually, I can use traditional flour with baking soda, baking powder, and salt and get a similar outcome. So when I asked at the beginning, could we have the recipe, I was given the 9 principles for co-innovation. So I'm not going to read through the details of the 9 principles, but one of the things that as a person I found tricky about these principles is that every time I've presented them, the feedback that I've gotten is from other people who work in extension or development or research is that they just look like good practice. So even if good practice isn't necessarily common practice, when you present them to people, they don't necessarily sound revolutionary. So as an example, I pre-tested this presentation last week at DairyNZ, and feedback from a coworker had been, this looks like something we've been doing for decades. So one of the challenges of those 9 principles of co-innovation is people's perception of them. Also from a practitioner's perspective, they may be good practice, but they aren't very informative on how you should go about approaching your project or your program. And in whatever approach you take, what do you do if you get to a sticking point? So getting started, I felt a bit like I was going grocery shopping because I needed to do some cooking, but I wasn't sure how many people I was cooking for, what kind of meals I was making, or what I'd be serving. So I'm not going to get into the details of what we did do, but you've got a bit of aspect around how we approached it. So this was the first year that from the dairy season 13-14. Probably the key point to take out of here is that we were doing a lot of activity. There was a lot of stakeholder engagement, and we took 7 to 10 months to finalize the project plan for what exactly the project outputs were. And so that long lead-in time was about taking the time to understand the problem and look at it from a lot of different point of views. So this was the end of our first year, and our cooking was a bit underway. The project strategy that we chose had 4 streams of work, and it was based on the feedback that we'd gotten from both a technical advisory group that had run in that first year, as well as 8 focused groups that ran across the country. And those resources and tools that were coming through in those key work areas were the products or the resources that farmers and stakeholders had specifically requested in those engagement aspects. So we aren't particularly clear on what's stopping heifers from being grown better, but this is what the feedback from the end user and from stakeholders was saying. These are the resources or information that will help us improve the way that we grow heifers on our farm. So that led into year 2, the 14-15 season. And we started running some focus farms to help us define what good practice was for growing heifers. So graziers opened up their farms for the local community to come visit. It also gave us an opportunity to test products, resources, and thinking that was being developed. Key point in here is that 6 months in, milk price fell, and DairyNZ launched a tactics campaign, and both Rob Brazendale, who was the program manager at the time, and myself were expected to contribute our time to that, since it was significant for the dairy industry. So at this point, our cooking is getting a bit messy. Time and resource now has become limited. And it also started to show that although farmers and stakeholders were interested in participating, there wasn't much more commitment or contribution other than opinions, which, in their defense, no one other than DairyNZ was being paid to be involved in the work. And so it was our day job and not necessarily theirs, and any time or energy they were contributing was at the cost of their own business. So that led into year 3, the 15-16 season. You can see there that tactics, the DairyNZ tactic program actually got bigger. Milk price fell again as well. It was a second season. We, as an organization, started doing more one-to-one interaction with dairy farmers at that time, and dairy farmer expectations increased of DairyNZ as well on the response, because it was what has happened with the drop in milk price. It would be since the 1980s since we would have seen anything this significant in change of income. So the other thing that also became a bit apparent that year is that not only did people just want to contribute their opinion, but they actually expected their opinion to be taken on board, and some were a bit surprised that other people didn't share their focus or their vision of what the outcomes would be. So at this point in time, from a project point of view, the kitchen was turning into a bit of a wreck, and really struggling on achieving agreement or compromise from stakeholders who had been involved. Just to give you a perspective on stakeholder engagement in the 3 years to date, so that 13-14 season, we came in really hot. There was a lot going on, and it has cooled off over time. It's hard. It can be hard to be motivated when there was the lack of success earlier on with the stakeholders, as well as there wasn't necessarily clarity on how to resolve the issues that were at play, as well as time and resource was dropping off. So work that was underway at the beginning of this season, 1st of June, we can see that there's actually a lot of stuff in the drafts and the scopes section, but it's, some of it had been sitting on ice, as well as some of it struggled to get out of the cooler and into the oven, really cooking. So when I started, what I was expecting to cook up is a bit like those Pinterest boards that you see around what people go out having in mind, and then they end up with something that only looks vaguely like they intended in the beginning. And it's probably a bit about how I feel at the moment of we had this intention of what we wanted to do going out, but hasn't quite hit the mark. So this gets me to the end of the first section, and I just have a bit of a question for you guys that are listening. John's going to open the poll now. With co-innovation, when we're working with the stakeholders, what is co-innovation for? Is it for agreement and co-ownership of the project and the outcome? Is it B, for consensus and alignment of project outcomes? Or C, is it a process for consultation and input from stakeholders on project outcomes? Or D, is it, it depends?
Good, thanks, Sarah. So I've got it open there, and let's see, a couple of people have voted, so any other final votes if you'd like to come in now? I'll close it off in 3, 2, 1, and I'll just share those results with everyone. So it appears as though they're tied between the last two, that a third of the people think it's consultation input, and actually 2/3 think it's it depends. So what are your thoughts about that, Sarah?
I went into it believing it was A, It was a way to get agreement, alignment, co-ownership. But in the end, we've ended up in a C, that it's a way that people have been able to contribute, but haven't taken on ownership. So my expectation of what I thought I was going to get and the outcome, like I said before, is quite different.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay, so now's the time for folks to have typed in some questions or comments. So I've just got a couple here to start with, Sarah. So I guess talking about your role in the project, were you given the authority to make the decisions and drive the project forward, or were you merely the project manager? Or what are your thoughts about that?
I guess I thought I was the project manager, and that somehow there would be a way to gain agreement with the stakeholders, and that co-innovation was going to supply me with some processes to achieve that. A couple weeks ago, I was in Germany in the Contemporary German History Museum in Bonn, and I saw this quote that I wish I'd taken a photo of about just as post-World War II, how Germany was trying to set up their own democratic, West Germany was trying to set up a democratic politics, that they said you just underestimate the amount of disagreement and debate that actually exists in democracy. And I thought, oh, that just reminds me of the Heifer grazing project. But in politics, you have a point that you vote and you move on, and you don't revisit that for 3 or 4 years. But in this process, we never had a final cutoff point where people voted and we got to move on.
Well, yeah, that sounds really interesting. Thank you for that. And just one more, and here we go. Here's another question. So what did you expect to get, and what did you actually get? Or will you be covering that in the next section, Sarah?
Well, I guess what I expected to get was agreement and co-ownership. What I ended up getting was people's input. But I also think we kind of created an expectation where we were going to get agreement. And so I'm now in a position on how do I interact or communicate with these stakeholders that I cannot just take their point of view on board. Sometimes it feels like they almost haven't heard the other points of view that were at the table, even though we did put time and effort into getting everyone in the room and having discussions on these topics.
Okay. And just one last question for this section. So of all the different processes that you've done, which one did you find most beneficial?
So we've used a series of processes. What I wish I had was a process that that a decision was made and people were moved forward. The most useful part was the focus groups at the beginning, I would say, where we went out into the regions and got feedback from regional stakeholders and farmers, and we ended up getting a better perspective on the challenges between relationship management for people who are contract growing heifers and the people that own the heifers, which hadn't really been on our radar prior to the start of the project.
Good. So Sarah, congratulations. We're now exactly halfway through the time for the webinar. So you're doing really well. So let's move on to the second half.
Excellent. Okay. So this is a bit of my perspective on the process. So for those 9 principles of co-innovation, I was reflecting on them in the context of cooking and the recipe, and it reminds me of the beginning of my favorite cookbook, the Better Homes and Gardens cookbook, Chapter 1. It's called Cooking Basics. And the Cooking Basics chapter is full of all kinds of useful information, like pots and pans and the different kinds of uses, the food pyramid, the difference between slicing, dicing, chopping, and julienne, good table manners, draft menus, RSVP etiquette, even how to set ambiance at a dinner or how to set a table. So good, useful information for cooking and dining. However, it doesn't actually tell you how to cook, which was one thing that I was looking for. So from the process, I of the opinion that our problem didn't justify the AIS or the co-innovation approach. So regarding the barriers and the obstacles to heifer grazing, one of the challenges we've faced is that there isn't a complete absence of knowledge here. There's actually a lot of knowledge that just needs to be consolidated and interpreted and made accessible. So people weren't necessarily participating to build the knowledge, rather they were participating to inform what questions they wanted answered. Another thing, we have this cultural expectation for knowledge within the dairy industry. So within the DairyNZ culture, what is evidence? And that is stuff that's debated within our organization. So for some people, evidence is only peer-reviewed research trials, while other people don't perceive that to be evidence. But we have created a culture around trial work within the industry. And so we actually have an absence here of more recent trial work, or we don't necessarily have all the answers from science. So there's been a lot of questions about why are you doing this? Why aren't you actually doing a research trial? And another aspect of the process is not everything should be different. So co-innovation is actually just one of the arrows that we have in our quiver, and it should be something that actually suits the purpose. There are aspects where, other extension approaches are more suitable depending on the information or the outcomes you're trying to achieve in your process. The other thing I reflected on was stakeholder engagement, and key issue we've had is incentives for being involved. So people are quite happy to attend a couple meetings and put their point of view forward. But as far as shared ownership, we've talked about actually needing some funding that's at stake. So it's part of your day job. In heifer grazing, there aren't the same level of commercial risks that maybe make up a burning platform that would incentivize stakeholders to participate. So there were a number of commercial companies where I felt like they attended meetings simply to kind of keep their finger on the pulse so they could adapt their own commercial response to whatever we did, rather than participating in that expectation I had around shared ownership. The other aspect of stakeholders is just the relationship. So an individual relationship versus a project or an organizational relationship. And one of our stakeholders was having an extension event, and they were quite specific that if they didn't get an individual that they wanted, then what they were going to do at their event didn't necessarily align with what we had agreed was good practice. So need to think about how organizations create relationships with each other as stakeholders, rather than just myself holding or retaining relationships, and getting people that are representative of their organization or department. So I ran one meeting where I was quite clear on what I thought I was quite clear on the outcome we wanted to achieve, but as the meeting got underway, people started saying, oh, well, I'm not the right person to make that decision, which just delays progress, even though prior to the meeting they had said, yeah, no, I'm absolutely the right person to be participating in this. So for me personally, it just feels like I've got a lot of work to do to tidy up the kitchen. So from a perspective going forward, I think if I was going to have another go at it, I would want more guidance on how to do it. And I know that you can't just have a prescriptive recipe in some of these situations, but even in my favorite cookbook, they give guidance on if you have this cut of meat, this is a good way to cook it. So you don't put filet mignon in the crock pot. You've got a different approach to that. Or if you're going to bake a cake, these are the kinds of things you need to have sorted before you start. Or these are the lettuces that are most suitable to these different kinds of salads. That you can give people guidance on what they should do without being so prescriptive as actually giving a recipe. What I have found to be the closest thing to a recipe book, my single most useful source, is actually Communication for Rural Innovation from Case Lewis, and forgive me if I mispronounced his first name. That I'm just going to touch on the one of the chapters that actually has 7 tasks for innovation processes that I found quite useful. And I've just listed there some other influences that have impacted on my thinking around how we work with multi-stakeholders or creating an environment that's ready for change or enabling people to change. So at the beginning of the project, Mark Payne, who is our DairyNZ strategy and investment leader, asked me to keep a reflection journal, which no one will ever get to read because it reads a bit like a teenage girl's diary. But I took the reflection journal and the comments that I had made in there about the difficulties of the first step of preparing for the process, and I've compared this with Task 1 from Chapter 14 from the Communication from Rural Innovation book, and it has 6 things that you need to do in Task 1, and 5 out of those 6 things that they've identified in their book were common themes or threads that I picked up on in my reflection journal. So number 1, the reconnaissance of existing or past initiatives and local innovation capacity. So retrospectively, I wish I could have gone back in the past and taken more time at the beginning to understand what had been done in the past, which would have led me to preliminary stakeholder analysis and conflict assessment. So understanding what those conflicts were between the stakeholders, because it turned out there was actually a 30 to 40 year history sitting in behind some of these conflicts. Something else that the book identifies that I didn't necessarily pick up in my reflection journal, but to identify broad areas or boundaries for interactive intervention. And I would say that now, as I'm trying to deliver on outcomes, that this has come more into play, that I'm recognizing, we didn't necessarily put as definite borders as we could have to make it easier now. Assessing and creating institutional space for using results from interactive processes. So sometimes there are ways that we operate both within the organization as well as how other stakeholders interact that don't allow for the time necessary to achieve the goals that we've got here. Oops, sorry about that. and selecting representative stakeholders, which I've also mentioned, and the interdependence of the criteria for stakeholder participants, which is a bit about that funding. So I've got a bit to chew through in the next year before the funding wraps up. So those are my learnings. Any other questions or discussions that we want to have?
Great, thanks, Sarah. So let's see. So folks, this is your time to type in those questions and comments for Sarah. So the first one is, question here, Sarah, is saying, after all that you've done, do you feel that the project has been able to achieve its goals?
To date, we haven't achieved the outputs that within the timelines that we had initially promised. So some of that is about the changing context of what was happening within the dairy industry. And my expectation around that shared ownership of the project, that hasn't been achieved. No.
Okay, good. Now, you talked about stakeholder engagement. So the question is, yes, did you engage with any different or new stakeholders as a result of using the AIS approach?
So we did engage with stakeholders that we hadn't necessarily interacted with on a national level in the past because we were more intent on involving a wide set of stakeholders.
Okay. And another question here is, do you think the outcome that you've achieved is any different because you used a co-innovation process?
So the mix of products or resources that we will end up supplying to the industry will be different because that initial focus group interaction that we had, I had feedback that the type of products we're supplying is quite traditional of what most projects would deliver, and my only response to that is it's what the farmers and the stakeholders asked for. Now, is that because that's what we always give them, or is that because they genuinely see that that's what would be useful to them? And I don't know.
Okay. Now, earlier in the presentation, Sarah, you said that the co-innovation principles were kind of just good practice. So the question is, does DairyNZ really apply these principles all the time on their projects?
I don't think any organization can say hand on heart, we always do good practice. And it is debated within the organization. Some people perceive that, yes, we mostly live by good practice, while other employees would say, oh, we give lip service to it, but we don't necessarily implement it. So just like in heifer grazing, there's a wide variety of views on how people go about implementing good practice and extension.
Okay, so earlier on you mentioned that it was focus groups, running the focus group at the beginning of the project that you found most beneficial. Do you do that often in many other projects?
It ranges. There's a range of ways that people approach focus groups. I do not know that it is that common for scientists, developers, extension agents to go to every region and run a focus group. So in that sense, I think that was different. Typically, a focus group might be people are invited to come to Hamilton where the head office is and participate in something, or a survey might be completed either online or over the phone.
Sure. Okay. we're running a little close to time now, but just another question for you. So you've talked a bit about relationships and networks. So how can organisations move past individual relationships and widen out to organisational networks?
Oh goodness! If I had that answer, I probably wouldn't be a project manager at DairyNZ. I'd be a strategic leader at DairyNZ. I genuinely don't know. It's something I struggled with is that, or I currently struggle with, is that I am a project manager, yet for the most part I retain 80% of the relationships of what we've built through the project, and we just underestimate the amount of time stakeholder relationships take, as well as one stakeholder. We would have interacted with 6 different individuals in the last 3 years. So in that case, we weren't even able to build an individual relationship, much less scale it up to an organizational relationship.
Sure.
So I don't know.
Okay. That's okay. We'll squeeze in one last question, and that is, were there any findings that were as a result of the co-innovation process that would not have otherwise been found?
No, because it hasn't necessarily been a pure research project. I suppose one thing that has become clearer around heifer management is the impact of the calf stage, so the first 3 months of life, and how much of an impact it has on the next 18 months. And that was just through farm demonstration and tracking animals on farm that became clearer. So that might be one.
Okay, good. Well, we've run out of time, so at this stage I'll now pass back to Niels to just say a few concluding words for us.
Okay guys, we're online. Yeah, thank you Sarah for talking to us. This is quite a complex topic, and for practitioners, you know, making sense of a cookbook, not having done it before, can be quite daunting. Thank you for your feedback and your insights, and I really enjoyed it, and looking forward to the next webinar, everybody. Thank you.